Some of the items that I'd like to touch upon is really that the digital environment, and we've heard it over the last few days, it really is global in nature. Think of internet users. They can typically view websites and content from anywhere in the world, subject to copyright or other limitations. We've talked about global e-commerce. That enables buyers in one country to purchase goods and services from sellers in another country. With online communications, people can video conference, call, and message for free or at relatively low cost, regardless of location and borders. And billions of these transactions occur daily, and it involves every sector. We've heard about this cross-sectoral collaboration. We've seen it. I think that's a key issue to think of when we're talking about this digital transformation. And it's been very interesting to look at the areas and subjects that we do need to address, because we're not just talking about ICT telecoms, just voice communications anymore. We're talking about voice, data, image. And so we do have these cross-border issues, data protection, privacy, consumer protection, but also public safety and national security. So that governments, policymakers, regulators have found that national laws, that harmonization of national laws, it really is even more important now than 30 years ago when I started, so that everybody can access the global markets and realize the benefits of the global economy. I always say I am who I am because of digital. I'm a mother, I'm a wife. I used to be a daughter, unfortunately, I lost both my parents. I'm a sister, I'm a friend, I'm a professional, and digital has enabled me to be what I am. But we heard, Cindy, this morning, we need those workable international standards that can promote regulatory harmonization. It can enable industry players to leverage the economies of scale to better deliver those new technologies and services and avoid a patchwork of regulations that can be contradictory from one country to another. We've heard time and time again over these last couple of days that contradiction is not good, especially for small markets. So we really want to look at the institutional collaboration model to encompass collaboration at the global, regional, and national level, that cross-sectoral collaboration. And I saw Helen yesterday, I don't know if she's online today, but we did work together on digital financial inclusion, where together we brought ICT and financial services regulation together to really have an impact in national implementation, focusing on 3 countries in particular in our work on Egypt, Mexico, and China. And we really worked on infrastructure, but also consumer protection and some of these other issues. So in my presentation, I'll look at these national and international and regional commitments and the impact thereof, starting with the GATS. I'll talk a little bit about HIPCAR and my friend Cleveland, my friend and colleague, but first and foremost, my friend Cleveland and I worked very hard on the HIPCAR project way back when, Cleveland, when we were still young and energetic. And so Cleveland can pitch in, of course, and provide you with any further information he has, because obviously as the area office representative here, I bow to him for advice on the region. But then I'll go into some of the telecoms regulation, and then the digital transformation as well, and look at the impact of regulation, the economic impact of regulation, and set the scene for the panel that Rodney then will moderate for us. So when I started my career with the GATS negotiations, the Uruguay round, the Doha round, countries and regions made global and regional commitments to open their telecommunications markets, to harmonize the local legislation with that of other countries, to encourage foreign investment in the sector, and to leverage investment in downstream sectors relying on ICT. And those commitments, we saw them serve to accelerate regulatory reform, with specific focus on facilitating global or regional best regulatory practices and providing telecoms investors with a level of certainty and predictability. So if we look at the GATS commitments, when the 69 member nations of the World Trade Organization agreed to open their markets to companies from other WTO members, this was back in 1997, they also adopted a document that was unique. It was really unique, the reference paper on regulatory principles. We had an annex that established that each WTO member state shall ensure that service suppliers of any other member are accorded access to and use of public telecom transport network and services on reasonable and non-discriminatory terms and conditions for the supply of a service included in its schedule. And then the reference paper was negotiated based on an understanding of the nature of what was then telecoms markets. In particular, that even when open to competition, it's essential that the market be regulated in order to allow new entrants to compete with entrenched incumbent operators referred to as major suppliers. So a country making those commitments had to modify its laws and regulations to ensure compliance with these obligations. And I've worked in countries way back when, in the late 90s, early 2000, I actually worked in a country in the Middle East, in Jordan, and they thought, oh, no, we can continue with our monopoly operator. This is just a commitment. No, it's not. It was a commitment that was important, and they had to abide by the commitment they made. They had to liberalize and open their market and reshape and reform their telecommunications sector. So they are a treaty obligation, and it does necessitate changes in domestic law and regulations. Some countries had already made those changes before making the commitments, but others got really wound up in these negotiations, made the commitments, and then said, oops, I made these commitments, now I have to make the reforms. So what was unusual about the telecom sector is that a number of WTO members made basic telecom commitments between 1997 and 2002 outside of the context of the round of negotiations, because it was really important. It was important because the reference paper provided a blueprint of best practice for countries designing telecoms policy, legislation, and regulation. Also for countries that wanted to join the WTO. So it was a minimum common denominator of regulatory practices that was being built amongst the WTO member countries. And it also was used as a template for bilateral and regional trade agreements. And some regional trade agreements, free trade agreements, were improved or were tweaked based on these GATS instruments. And don't take it lightly, because multinational companies take these GATS commitments seriously. They're well informed of the rights and benefits to which GATS actually entitles them. There was a case, the Mexico case, that suggested that suppliers are likely to increasingly use GATS commitments to secure markets and pursue GATS benefits. So it is important, and it is a big deal. And foreign investment follows such commitments. So one of the things I've been working with the WTO Secretariat, and it's very important, and that will come to one of the other points that I have in my presentation later on. When we're looking at this digital transformation, we're not just talking about infrastructure anymore. We're talking about access, adoption, and value creation. And for that, the digital transformation means that all sectors need to work together. And when you have these regional commitments and these regional negotiations, it means that you need to keep your trade negotiators up to par with what is happening in the digital sphere and how digital impacts the economies, how digital impacts agriculture, health, education, all of these other sectors, finance, they're impacted by digital, and your trade negotiators need to be aware of that, because they need to be aware of where this impact lies. So some of the key principles of the reference papers, they seem old, but yet they're still relevant. We have the independent regulatory authority. And independent doesn't mean the Wild West. There is accountability, there is transparency, there is process. So independent means that it must be independent in its day-to-day functional, structural, and financial independence. But we see across the world that there is the reporting, sometimes reporting to the Prime Minister, to the Parliament, but there is that accountability. It also, that means the fair market. We need that transparency and the fairness in the market. We also need that interconnection and interoperability. The finance folks that are here know very well we need that interoperability, and for that we need interconnection. We need the public availability of some core principles and criteria, one of which was identified in the WTO reference paper as the licensing criteria. If we think way back to the 80s and 90s, when we started opening up the markets, when we went from the monopoly or from government-owned entities that were providing telecom services to new players on the market, the market started opening very gradually, starting here in the Caribbean with the value-added services. There were loopholes that were found, but you needed those transparent licensing criteria, which doesn't mean you need heavy-handed licensing principles and processes. You can have what the Americans called unlicensed, but unlicensed doesn't mean unregulated. You need the flexible and agile regulation to allow that innovation, to allow new market players. But you need to keep in mind that at the very end of the day, it's about people. So at the very end of the day, quality of service and consumer protection are key. So even if it's when it's unlicensed, there are some basic principles there, but you need that public availability of those licensing criteria. We heard yesterday from Annie about universal service. That was already in the reference paper. Administer universal service programs in a transparent, non-discriminatory, and competitively neutral manner. Again, that hasn't changed. We need to allocate and assign the use of scarce resources looked at as numbering, spectrum, and rights of way, and again in an objective, timely, transparent, and non-discriminatory manner. So those were the key principles in the reference paper. Now, if we look at the regional commitments, so we looked at the global commitments, the regional commitments, the regional institutions, we're looking at CTU, we're looking at regional institutions. They can also be very useful for policy making, training, technical assistance, research. Data is key. Evidence-based decision-making is key. And with ITU, I'm really pleased to hear how many of you reference ITU. We have great data, and we are ready and willing to work with the Commonwealth Secretariat, with CTU, to share our data, to have you help us ensure that we have the correct and up-to-date data, because evidence-based decision-making is key. And also that advocacy, the advocacy so that you in your respective governments can advocate for the importance of digital. And fortunately, one of the good things of COVID is that it hit us all in the face. Digital is important. If we would not have had digital, that lockdown, excuse my American slang, would have sucked, because we would have been locked down away from our jobs. Our kids would not have been able to continue their education. And even though it was challenging, you had the harms that were there, but still looking at the importance of digital and the challenges and opportunities of digital really became key. And I was really excited to see how much it came to the forefront, and excited that an institution like ITU was recognized for its importance. The work that we do was recognized for its importance. But one of the things as well, we've seen COVID, but we've also seen geopolitical challenges. And one of the things we must avoid is knee-jerk reactions. Balkanization of infrastructure firms, balkanization of the internet, especially amongst smaller states, can reduce the effectiveness of reforms. Because when markets naturally cross national borders, regional regulatory agreements and authorities, those agreements amongst neighboring countries for the mutual recognition of infrastructure operators, can facilitate the development of a seamless and competitive network. So looking at the regional integration of regulation combined with the regionalization of regulated firms, it can help us overcome national limits. It can enhance the national capacity to make credible commitments. It can facilitate the introduction of competition into historically monopolized market. We've seen it here in the region. We have the big guys that kept their power for long periods of time. And these commitments really helped the smaller markets to say, it's about the people. We need reform. We need the innovator to bring these services to our people so that the digital economy can benefit all, so that we can have affordable, available, and accessible communications to our people. So it also improves the efficiency of infrastructure industries by allowing them to grow without respecting economically artificial national boundaries. And I do believe that regional integration of reform and of companies does increase infrastructure investment because you have scale. The market comes to scale. Some of the key elements for success, we do need those clear mandates. We do need the clear resources. It doesn't help to create institutions and cut off their hands. You have to give them the financial and the human resources. We talked a lot about adoption and implementation. For implementation, you need the elbow grease, you need the resources, you need your staff to be able to go out into the world, to build their capacity, to be at these conferences, to listen to these discussions, to exchange, to learn, to exchange with peers. So looking at HIPCAR, oops, I was a bit too quick on the trigger here. Looking at HIPCAR. So HIPCAR was part of a global project, an EU project, where we looked at harmonization. It was HIPCAR in the Caribbean, HIPSA in Sub-Saharan Africa, and ICB for PAC for the Pacific. So it was designed to support the Caribbean countries in improving their competitiveness by harmonizing approaches to ICT development. Contrary to what we did in ECOWAS and CEDEAO in Western Africa, we didn't actually look at model telecommunications law, the holistic law, and the different elements. We started this harmonization work with ITU in West Africa, where we looked at model laws plus numbering, spectrum, interconnection, universal service, and licensing. Here we focused on three basic elements in the telecoms, and Vashti worked more on the cyber data protection side. But I'm talking about the telecom side, where we looked at universal service, licensing, and interconnection. And I know David Geary will be joining us later. I actually had a call with Andrew Gordon last week. And so we looked at, we had some great people, and I see Gary and Annie here, you were there with us. With JP Morgan, bless his soul, may he rest in peace, and Kwesi Prescott as well. So we worked on these three key important issues. What did we do? It was really a lot of capacity building, a lot of exchange, a lot of knowledge exchange. So we did assessments. We looked at the gaps, and that again yesterday we saw in some of the presentation, evidence-based decision-making. Look at the gaps, look at the evidence. We looked at the gaps, we looked at the laws, and we saw where are there common points, where are the gaps, what are some of the international best practices. Then we brought all stakeholders to the table to see where can we find the commonality. And then we followed up with regional implementation, where together with Cleveland, we worked in some countries to do some of the national implementation. I was pleased to have worked here in Barbados. I worked in St. Lucia. We worked with ECTEL. We worked with a number of the countries, but obviously resources were limited. We didn't work in all the countries, but we've kept this network. And as I say, we're still friends, right, Annie? So we worked together, and we worked on these various issues. So for the assessment, the regional policy, and the regional legislation. Yes, I realize. HIPCAR 2, we did propose a HIPCAR 2. Unfortunately, again, with all the donor agencies, it's a question of resources. You have an opportunity. COVID actually made the EU understand as well the importance of strategic partnerships. We do have the EU-LAC summit coming up. Digital is not quite on the top of the list of priorities. If you look at the fiche at the EU-LAC and the Caribbean priorities in particular, because there's poverty reduction, there's a number of issues that are top of the agendas in the Caribbean. But it's up to you to go and talk to the EU delegations in your countries prior to that summit to really bring digital at the top of the agenda, because the EU is figuring out what they want to do with this Team Europe approach. You have the D4D hub, you have the GovStack, you have a number of issues that the EU is working on. In Africa in particular, we're working on mapping, we're looking at capacity building, we're looking at regulatory reform. It's up to you to go and talk to the EU delegations to bring digital to the top of that list as well. I'm just going to skim over. And Rodney, I know I have the 10 minutes threat here over my head, but I just want to skip over some of these things about the importance of regulation and the impact of regulation. I talked about the GATS. So those countries that made the GATS commitments tended to outperform those countries that did not make GATS commitments. And critical questions are, what is the impact of government policies and regulation on the performance of the ICT sector as measured by capital investment, network deployment, service pricing, consumer demand, and ultimately impact on the economy? And is competition enough an incentive to drive an improvement of sector performance? Some food for thought. The regulatory institutional framework is very key. It's linked to a positive and significant increase in telecoms investment. A reduction in taxation is also associated with a significant boost in capital investment because it increases financial resources to network deployment. A reduction of government bureaucratic processes is linked to a significant increase of capital investment, and that confirms the relevance of public efficiency. And it also highlights the importance of reducing the required time for obtaining permits. And being affiliated to international internet organizations that promote sound regulations can also enhance a business-prone environment. So if we look at this, we saw an increase of 10% in fixed broadband penetration yields an increase of 0.77% in GDP. And 3 specific policy approaches are recommended. Incorporate the economic impact of digitalization in your assessment of policies, be collaborative and quick, and be transparent. I don't want to get in trouble, so I'll just skip through this and you will have this presentation. We also saw that countries with a 5-year membership of the WTO are linked to a 17.5% more investment than non-members. So again, that's the relevance of being part of international and regional commitments. Same thing goes for the OECD. So we're going towards this digital transformation. So how has regulation evolved? We've seen along the digital transformation road, we've seen along the digital transformation road, connectivity, technology, regulatory, market, and societal changes. If we think back to the 1980s, we look at the dawn of mobile and email, to data and the global networked society, smartphones, the digitalization of new parts of society, now the help to mitigate the global pandemic, and towards 2030, we're looking at universal and meaningful connectivity for all, and the digital economy and society, those digital nations, because digital impacts all sectors and aspects of people's lives. Think of e-health, e-agriculture, e-education, e-government services, innovation services for value creation, the skills. So we need to keep abreast of the different regulatory tools. This is actually the previous slide, but I'll just talk to this, and Vashti I had updated my presentation. This is the older presentation, but I'll speak to this one, it doesn't matter. So we have these regulatory tools and approaches that are at hand for enabling that sustainable digital transformation, the pro-competition frameworks, the regulatory incentives, the stakeholder investment, the robust enforcement mechanisms, the market-based mechanisms for spectrum management, and obviously the regulatory impact assessments. So we need to bring traditional and emerging regulation into the digital area. Regulations continue to address the traditional aspects, but they have to adapt their role to the rapidly changing digital environment. So we need to assess the need to modernize. So how do we evolve and adopt regulation? As we saw, and what Chris said before, more regulation is not always better. Consider deregulation, self-regulation, or co-regulation. And consider new regulatory approaches that are really tailored to digital, to emerging technologies and innovation. So let's go from a rules-based to a principles-based approach. So how has regulation evolved? We've gone from the command and control approach to what we have minted as the G5, the fifth generation of regulation, which we call the collaborative regulation and a harmonized approach across the sectors. So what are some of our economy and regulation and policy tools? We have our ICT regulatory tracker. So it's really the evidence-based decision-making. We have the digital ecosystem portal. We have our infrastructure development portal. So there's lots of good materials there. As you all have quoted, there's lots of good material. So please do visit our website to visit our portal. And Rodney, maybe if in the panel we do have 5 minutes left, we can bring up my revised presentation, because I did have the Wheel of Digital Transformation there that looks at the ITU approach towards digital transformation, and maybe we can share it with you and we can look at that. We also have the Digital Regulation Handbook and Platform. We talk about capacity building. We've just launched our online modules on our platform. Feel free to register for those self-paced online modules. Is there a silver bullet? Well, evidence-based decision-making, know where you are in terms of access, adoption, and value creation. You need that evidence-based decision-making. Create that conducive ecosystem. Upgrade your regulatory and legal framework. Build the foundations for universal and meaningful connectivity. Address the middle and last mile as well. Don't forget to invest in people. Focus on the disadvantaged groups and anticipate the future skill needs. Don't forget partnership, partnership, partnership. And also that will allow you to kickstart and sustain the digital transformation. And that digital transformation, it's about users, technologies, and data. It's about the people. It's about the data. It's about access, adoption, and value creation. And when you look at the digital transformation, look at the institutional frameworks, the legal frameworks, the sectoral requirements, the connectivity requirements, the cybersecurity requirements, also the data, the digital skills, the digital ecosystem, the green economy, the circular economy, and innovation. Look at all of these: access, adoption, and value creation towards the digital transformation, because digital transformation is important for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sofie, for an excellent presentation. And of course, I'll be sure to pull up the presentation on the digital transformation wheel. At this time, I'd like to kindly invite any questions from our audience. Yes, please, Chris.
Just a quick question on whenever I hear the word deregulation, I start to get alarm bells ringing all over the place, because I think politicians can interpret that as bonfire of regulations, just get rid of them. And that's actually in the context of digitalization of trade, if I just keep it in that context for a moment, that's exactly what we don't want. we actually want smart regulation, not deregulation. I just wonder what your thoughts were on that, and how do we present good regulatory ideas to government that then don't get interpreted the wrong way, because that's pretty dangerous in places, right?
Thank you. That was a provocative word that I put in my presentation exactly to get a reaction, and that's why I referred to it as, in inverted commas, deregulation, because I totally agree with you, Chris. We don't want the Wild West. However, we do want agile and flexible regulation, as you call it, smart regulation, which sometimes means stepping away from the heavy-handed regulation. And sometimes co-regulation or self-regulation are the tools that allow us to be smart. I hope that answers your question.
I have another question in the room. Go ahead. From the Telecommunications Authority.
Hi, Sofie, Jam from TAT. So my question follows from Chris's question. I want to know if you think, or how you think self-regulation or co-regulation can help regulators fulfill their mandate to manage spectrum.
So I think you need to make a clear distinction. So when we're talking about scarce resources, you're also talking about the public good, right? So there are certain levels or areas where, when the public safety and the public good come to bear, and where it's the mandate of the regulator to ensure that this public good is protected. There are certain areas where self-regulation or co-regulation is not appropriate. And that's what Chris mentioned. We need to be smart about regulation. We need to be agile, and we need to be flexible. So self-regulation and co-regulation can really be applied in certain areas. I would think certain areas of consumer protection, for example. But where we're looking at scarce resources, where the public interest is at hand, I would personally, as a lawyer, I would advocate, let the regulator carry out their mandate. And I just want to add to that. So these provocative words, you didn't jump on my unlicensed. So unlicensed, and it's like the same thing, deregulation, unlicensed. It doesn't, deregulation or smart regulation does not mean the Wild West. It's unlicensed does not mean the Wild West. There are certain principles, certain standards, as Cindy said, that must be respected. And there are certain areas that must be protected. So when it comes to public safety, public goods, then you must ensure that you carry out your mandate. I hope that responds to the question.
To add something as it relates to that question, the whole issue of self-regulation. And from my perspective, to engage in self-regulation, you would need to have the framework in place. So I understand, like in the UK, there are systems where, for instance, businesses can do the necessary as it relates to certifying origin. But that is because you have de-risked the whole exercise to a certain extent. And you have certain systems in place, starting at the border, where you can actually track sequences and movements of goods. So there's less risk involved. So as you were saying, there are instances where you can self-regulate, there are instances where you can deregulate, but in many instances, there already is a system in place to facilitate it.
And you need the transparency. You need the process, the system, the transparency, and the accountability. Chris.
Jump in on that. I think it's a really important point around ICC is a self-regulatory body for business, effectively. We've got an enormous rule book. And when we're going across borders, we're following the ICC rules, effectively, whatever country you're in. And I think there's a strong case for self-regulation in some areas. This is a bit controversial even within ICC, but just from basic practice and the conversations we get in, into. In some areas, there's a clear case for self-regulation, like the standards toolkit was a great example. The digital rules for trade transactions is another great example where we can self-regulate. We can follow those tracks and businesses will be good. But in other areas where it's quite controversial, like human rights, we tried self-regulation, it didn't work. But we know that full mandatory rules probably won't work either. So it's somewhere in between, right? It's probably a mixed economy, back to the smart regulation, co-regulation, working with business. I just think that in the more difficult areas, when we're trying to solve the same problem, it's about engagement with business and then designing regulation that works for all sides so that we get to the end goal, because we all want a net zero economy, no human rights abuses, all of those sorts of issues, and try and work together to solve them rather than saying it's either one or the other and then ping pong in between the two. It's not as simple as that. The world's a pretty complicated place. Otherwise, we would have solved these issues a long time ago.